My name is Susan Boyle. I'm nearly 48, and that's just one side of me. I come from Blackburn near Bathgate, West Lothian. Currently unemployed, but still looking. I've been a carer for my mother, though, for 2 years, and I'm going to sing for you on...
No fame, no glamour, just a voice, and the world stopped to listen. Susan Boyle, the woman from the Scottish village of Blackburn, entered our lives like something out of a real-life fairy tale. For decades, she lived in the shadows, misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and quietly enduring the pain of being different. But in 2009, everything changed. When she stepped onto the Britain's Got Talent stage, her voice shattered every expectation. She stunned the judges, silenced the doubters, and moved millions to tears. Her debut album would go on to top charts in both the UK and the US, becoming the most pre-ordered album in Amazon's history. Susan Boyle had become a global sensation, but the road that led her there was long, painful, and almost forgotten. Long before Susan Boyle became a global sensation, she was just a quiet little girl in a crowded house in Blackburn, Scotland, overlooked, underestimated, and painfully misunderstood. Born on April 1st, 1961, the youngest of 10 children, she entered a world that had no time to slow down for someone like her. Her father, Patrick, a World War II veteran, worked grueling hours in a mining plant. Her mother, Bridget, a kind but exhausted shorthand typist and gifted pianist, held the family together with everything she had. But love in that house was often drowned out by survival. At birth, Susan suffered a brief lack of oxygen, a moment that would cast a shadow over her entire childhood. Doctors labeled it mild brain damage. To others, it became a sentence. She was branded as slow, strange, less. The heartbreak began early. School wasn't a place of learning. It was a battleground. Children laughed at her, called her Susie Simple, and mocked the way she spoke and moved. But what was truly cruel was how the adults responded. Teachers dismissed her, some punishing her harshly for what they couldn't understand. When she struggled to focus, they reached for the belt instead of compassion. And when Susan experienced seizures, terrifying, uncontrollable, no one stopped to ask why. They just called her broken. Home should have been her refuge. But even there, safety was uncertain. Her father had a quick temper, and when he lashed out, it was Susan who often absorbed the blows, physically, emotionally, silently. Her mother, though loving, was overprotective to a fault. She sheltered Susan so tightly that the girl never learned how to stand on her own. The world was cruel, but so was the cage of protection that held her back from living. And then came heartbreak of a different kind. In her mid-20s, Susan met someone, a young man named John. For the first time, she felt seen, loved, but her parents intervened. They said she wasn't ready, not strong enough, not capable of making her own decisions. The relationship ended, not by heartbreak, but by control, and it left a scar just as deep. Looking back, Susan once said, "It felt like the world had written me off before I even had a chance to begin." It's a line that lingers, because it's true. Her childhood wasn't just difficult, it was tragic, it was cruel, and it was utterly heartbreaking. But through all of it, through the silence, the shame, the loneliness, one thing refused to die: music. Even when no one else believed in her, the melodies inside her never left. Music was never just a hobby for Susan Boyle. It was survival. In a world that told her she was less, her voice reminded her that she was still whole. Her mother, Bridget, recognized it early. She filled their small home with music, playing piano as Susan hummed beside her. It was the only time the house felt warm, the only time Susan felt seen. Susan joined the church choir as a child, singing quietly at first, afraid to be noticed, afraid to be judged. But little by little, her voice grew stronger. At local talent shows, she stood nervously, with trembling hands, pouring every ounce of herself into songs that barely got applause. The crowd didn't know what to make of her. She didn't look like a star, she didn't dress the part, and in an industry obsessed with appearance, that was enough to dismiss her. She auditioned for small TV shows, clung to dreams that most would have buried. In 1995, she sang, "I Don't Know How to Love Him" on Michael Barrymore's My Kind of People. The audience laughed before she even opened her mouth. The host joined in, and yet, she sang anyway. It wasn't applause she got. It was humiliation. But even in that moment, she didn't walk off. That was Susan. Wounded, but never defeated. She saved up what little she had to record demo tapes. Killing Me Softly, Cry Me a River, and Don't Cry for Me, Argentina. She mailed them to record labels, talent scouts, even local radio stations. Each envelope sent with a prayer, and every silence in return, another heartbreak. It would have been so easy to quit, to believe the world's message, "You don't belong here." But Susan didn't stop. Why? Because her mother never let her. Bridget told her again and again, "You've got something, Susan, don't hide it. Someday, someone will listen." That someday wouldn't come quickly, but when it did, it would change everything. April 11th, 2009, a day that began like any other, until a quiet, middle-aged woman stepped onto the stage of Britain's Got Talent in Glasgow. She wore no makeup. Her dress was plain, her hair untamed, her walk hesitant and unsure. When Susan Boyle said she was 47 and had never been kissed, the crowd chuckled. The judges exchanged glances, laced with disbelief. People in the audience rolled their eyes. She didn't look like a star. She didn't belong, at least not according to their expectations. And then, she sang, "I dreamed a dream from Les Miserables." The very first note broke through the noise like a blade of light. It was strong, pure, unapologetically emotional. The room fell silent. The laughter stopped. Simon Cowell leaned forward. Amanda Holden clutched her chest. It was as if the entire theater was holding its breath, terrified of missing a single note. By the time Susan reached the chorus, the audience erupted. They stood, they roared, some cried, some looked down in shame, because everything they had assumed about how someone should look, how old they should be, what a dream should sound like, was shattered. Amanda Holden later called it the biggest wake-up call ever. Simon Cowell was speechless, and backstage, even the other contestants froze behind the curtain, stunned by what they'd just witnessed. But what made that moment unforgettable wasn't just the technical brilliance. It was the weight behind it. Susan Boyle had waited 47 years to be heard, and when the world finally listened, she soared. Within hours, her audition went viral. Tens of millions of views poured in from across the globe. Celebrities like Demi Moore and Ashton Kutcher tweeted about her. News anchors raced to learn her name. She hadn't even won the competition, but it didn't matter. Because in that moment, she had already won something far greater, the world's respect. And for millions watching, especially those who had ever been laughed at, dismissed, or told they were too old, Susan Boyle wasn't just a contestant. She was a symbol. She was their voice. In that moment, she didn't just sing. She made the world stop and ask, what does it really mean to dream? And who gets to dream at all? The world fell in love with Susan Boyle overnight. Her voice had broken barriers. Her story had inspired millions. But while the cameras focused on her triumphant rise, few noticed what was happening behind the scenes. Fame had not saved her. It had swallowed her. In the weeks following her Britain's Got Talent debut, Susan's life shifted from quiet streets in West Lothian to the blinding flash of international fame. Every major TV network wanted her. Interview requests flooded in. Paparazzi camped outside her house. But Susan wasn't ready, emotionally, mentally, or physically, for what came next. Behind the makeup chairs and photo ops, she was exhausted. For someone who had spent nearly 5 decades in silence, the noise was deafening. She was being asked to smile, perform, and speak on command, as if she were a machine, not a woman who had just cracked open her soul on national television. She didn't know how to say no. She didn't want to disappoint anyone, so she kept going. Even when her body begged her to stop, sleep eluded her. Anxiety set in. She began to unravel. On the outside, she was a success story, but on the inside, Susan was slipping through the cracks. She began to experience panic attacks, disorientation, and sudden mood swings. Rumors swirled, the tabloids began to circle, and just hours after the BGT finale, Susan was rushed to a private clinic in London. The official reason? Exhaustion. But the truth was deeper. She had been crushed under the weight of expectations. of being the voice of hope for millions while silently crying for help herself. It wasn't the stage that broke her. It was everything that came after it. The headlines, the pressure, the loss of privacy, the sudden shift from nobody to national treasure, with no manual on how to survive the middle. In those first nights at the clinic, away from the world, Susan didn't sing. She didn't speak much. She just sat by the window, watching the rain fall on the city she didn't belong to. Her voice, once her escape, now felt like a chain pulling her into chaos. But Susan wasn't weak. She was overwhelmed, and what she needed, more than fame, more than applause, was space to breathe, to heal, to understand what had just happened to her life. The dream hadn't failed. It had simply arrived too fast, too loud, and without warning. While the world saw Susan Boyle as a voice of hope behind closed doors, she was just Susan, a woman navigating grief, loneliness, and the quiet ache of a love life that never blossomed. Fame didn't rescue her from solitude. In many ways, it deepened it. She never left her childhood home in Blackburn, West Lothian. Even after millions of albums sold and global fame, she still slept in the same modest bedroom where she once cried as a little girl. The paint may have changed, but the ghosts remained. Her mother, Bridget, was her entire world. Her shield, her compass, her best friend. When Bridget passed away in 2007, everything inside Susan fell silent. She locked herself in the house for days, unable to eat, answer the door, or speak to anyone. The house grew colder, the air thicker, her cat Pebbles curled up by her side, perhaps the only soul who truly understood the depth of her loss. Susan once said, "When Mum died, a part of me died too. I sang for her, not for the world." Every note she had ever practiced, every dream she ever chased, had been for Bridget. And now, that anchor was gone. All of her siblings had moved on with their lives. Susan stayed, not because she had no choice, but because that home, for all its emptiness, was the last place she ever felt truly loved. The fame outside meant little compared to the silence within. Romantic love, too, was something that always seemed just out of reach. At 25, she had fallen for a man named John. It was tender, innocent, real, but her father didn't approve. He thought she wasn't mature enough, independent enough. The relationship ended before it even began. Decades later, she still remembered how it felt to have her first chance at love quietly erased. No confrontation, no closure, just a heartbreak buried under obedience. She's often joked, never married, never been kissed, but behind that smile was a truth few people dared to ask about, a lifetime of yearning. She once confessed in an interview that her biggest regret wasn't missing out on more fame, but on motherhood. "I would have loved to be a mom," she said, "to read stories, to hold their little hands." It wasn't about legacy. It was about connection, about never being someone's person. She had considered adoption. She had even spoken to professionals. But life kept pulling her away. Tours, health, exhaustion. And over time, she quietly tucked the dream away, not out of bitterness, but out of surrender. Still, Susan found her own quiet way of giving. She sang in her local church choir. She volunteered to visit elderly members of the parish. She made tea. She sat. She listened. Perhaps because she knew what it meant to have no one. Her cat Pebbles, now gone, had been her companion for 19 years. After her passing, Susan didn't adopt another. "No soul could replace her," she whispered once. That's how she saw relationships. Not replaceable, not casual, but sacred. She had the voice of an angel. But she lived like a shadow, moving softly through a world that often shouted over her silence. Susan Boyle gave us her voice, but the silence she came home to, that was the price she quietly paid. Just when Susan Boyle thought the darkest parts of her life were behind her, a new storm began to form, one that would strike not her career, but her body, her mind, and the very thing that defined her existence, her voice. In 2012, Susan was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism that explained much of what she had endured since childhood. For decades, she believed she had suffered brain damage at birth, and that belief colored every experience, every insult, every doubt. The diagnosis came late, but it brought clarity. I always felt like I didn't fit, she said. Now I know why. It was painful, but it also brought peace. Not long after, life delivered another blow, type 2 diabetes. For someone who had found comfort in sweets, especially chocolate, this new reality felt cruel. It wasn't just about giving up sugar. It was about giving up the little indulgences that had brought joy in moments of pain. Susan had to rewire her habits, her body, and her routine. She started walking daily, not for fitness, but for survival. Every step was an act of resistance against a disease quietly tightening its grip. But none of that could compare to what came next. In April 2022, Susan suffered a minor stroke, but to her, it didn't feel minor at all. She woke up and couldn't speak properly. Her mouth felt heavy, her words slurred. Her balance shifted, and then the worst realization hit her. She couldn't sing. For a moment, everything went quiet. Her voice, the very thread that had stitched together her purpose, was gone. No spotlight, no stage. Just silence. For a woman whose soul lived through song, this wasn't an injury. It was a kind of death. Her days turned into whispered frustration. "I'm trying," she'd say, but the notes wouldn't come out right. She began speech therapy. It was slow, grueling, and full of setbacks. The first time she tried to hum, her throat closed. The first time she tried to say hello, it came out broken. Her therapist told her it might not come back the way it was. But Susan had faced doubt before, and just like every time, she answered with quiet strength. Each session was a battle, each improvement, a victory. She practiced scales while holding back tears. She relearned how to breathe, how to place her voice, how to believe that it still lived inside her. And through it all, she kept a single goal in her heart: to stand again on the stage that gave her life. In June 2023, the world held its breath. Susan Boyle returned to the Britain's Got Talent stage, not as a contestant, but as a survivor. As she stood beside the West End cast of Les Miserables, her hands trembled, her heart pounded, but her voice, her beautiful, aching, resurrected voice, rose into the air. She sang "I Dreamed a Dream," the same song that changed her life years before. But this time, every lyric carried new weight. It wasn't just a song, it was her story, the struggle, the silence, the fight, the rebirth. The crowd erupted. Judges rose to their feet. But Susan, she simply closed her eyes and let the music carry her. It was more than a comeback. It was a miracle. It was not just her voice that returned. It was her soul. And when the final note faded, there were no dry eyes in the room, because what we had just witnessed wasn't performance. It was resurrection. Fame came fast for Susan Boyle, and so did the chaos. But today, she no longer chases stages, cameras, or headlines. She's chosen a different kind of spotlight, one that shines quietly through humility, routine, and grace. For Susan, the greatest achievement was never the global tours or platinum records. It was reclaiming her peace. She still lives in her modest home in Blackburn, West Lothian, the same council house where she grew up as the youngest of 10 children, where she once sat in silence, dreaming of a stage she'd never seen, while she had enough wealth to buy a mansion. And for a while, she did. She eventually gave that house to her niece. "This little home has my memories," she said. "This is where I feel safe." For someone who spent most of her life feeling like she didn't belong, that feeling matters more than any red carpet ever could. Inside that humble house, nothing screams celebrity. There are no gold-framed awards lining the walls, no shelves filled with flashy memorabilia. Just a few photos, a quiet piano, and a kettle always warm. She tends to her flowers. She watches quiz shows on TV. She walks to the nearby shops, where locals greet her, not as a superstar, but simply as our Susan. And that's exactly how she likes it. After years of intense travel, constant pressure, and medical setbacks, Susan has scaled back her public appearances. But she hasn't disappeared. When her health allows, she still performs at special events. Not for money, not for fame, but for the sheer joy of singing. In recent years, she's appeared on charity programs, surprise guest segments, and most meaningfully, back on the very stage where it all began. Britain's Got Talent. In 2023, after suffering a minor stroke just months earlier, Susan made a triumphant return to that stage to sing I Dreamed a Dream once more. The performance wasn't just a comeback. It was a moment of quiet victory, of inner strength reclaimed. Fans, judges, and even backstage crew were moved to tears. It wasn't about vocal perfection. It was about resilience. Her voice, although more fragile, carried deeper meaning than ever before. Susan's legacy is not measured in chart positions or record-breaking sales, though she has plenty. With over 25 million albums sold, multiple Grammy nominations, and even a Guinness World Record for the fastest-selling debut album by a female artist. Her place in music history is undeniable. She's been recognized by the Queen, with an Order of the British Empire, for her contributions to music and charity. She's performed for presidents and royals, and yet she still sings in her church choir when she's home. But perhaps her greatest legacy is how she made people feel. She proved that a dream deferred is not a dream denied. That talent doesn't require perfection. That kindness and vulnerability can still touch hearts in a cynical world. Susan Boyle became a symbol, not of success, but of second chances, and she's never forgotten what matters most. She's spoken often about her love of children, and although she never had any of her own, she's seriously considered adoption. I have so much love to give, she once shared. Maybe there's a child out there who needs that. Though nothing has been confirmed, her desire to nurture remains a tender part of her journey. Her faith continues to guide her. A devout Catholic, Susan still sings hymns in her parish choir, attends Mass regularly, and volunteers with elderly members of her community. She doesn't crave applause. She values presence, simply showing up for those who are lonely, ill, or forgotten, because she knows how that feels. Health remains a delicate part of her life. After her stroke, she's worked closely with therapists and doctors to maintain her voice and manage her diabetes. She no longer tours, but she records quietly when she can, and continues to rehearse privately. She knows every note costs energy, and she spends it wisely. Most days now, Susan Boyle lives slowly. She reads, she cooks, she talks to neighbors, she laughs at reruns of The Golden Girls. Her world has shrunk, but her heart has not. If anything, it's grown deeper, more open, more grateful. There's a quiet dignity in how she's chosen to live. In an industry obsessed with youth, flash, and constant reinvention, Susan has become a rare figure, someone who stepped out of the spotlight, not out of failure, but by choice. She didn't let fame rewrite her. She returned to her roots, and in doing so, held onto her soul. And in that little house, with the familiar walls and worn-out cushions, Susan Boyle is not just resting. She's living, on her own terms, with her own rhythm, and with a heart still echoing with song. So, have you heard what happened to Susan Boyle? On April 1st, 25, the day she turned 64, Susan returned to the public eye after a 2-year silence. In a quiet but powerful Instagram post, she wrote, "I'm back and working on some wonderful new projects that I can't wait for you to hear about." It was her first public statement since the stroke that nearly stole her voice. And just like that, the woman the world once counted out reminded us, she's not done dreaming. She didn't vanish. She didn't give up. She didn't fade into silence. She healed. She chose peace. She returned home, not just to the place where she was born, but to the core of who she truly is. What happened to Susan Boyle is something we don't hear enough about in this world of noise and fame. She became whole, not through applause, not through spotlight, but through surrendering to a quieter, richer kind of life, one where she no longer needed to prove herself, because she'd already won the battle that mattered most, the battle for her own dignity. In a world that often worships reinvention, Susan stayed who she was. In an industry obsessed with appearances, she let her voice and her heart speak louder. And when life struck hard, through illness, loneliness, or public scrutiny, she didn't crumble. She stood still, and in that stillness, we found something rare, grace. For millions around the globe, Susan Boyle is not just a singer. She is a reminder that dreams don't come with deadlines, that beauty has many forms, that strength is sometimes quiet, and that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. As we look back on her extraordinary story, We don't just remember the moment she stunned the world with her voice. We remember how she carried herself when the world wasn't watching. With humility, with honesty, with heart. Here at Celebs Rewind, we honor the ones who walked through fire and chose to love anyway. Susan Boyle walked through ridicule, heartbreak, misdiagnosis, illness, and unimaginable pressure, and emerged not bitter, but brighter, more human, more whole, and perhaps the most beautiful part of all, she never stopped dreaming. If her journey moved you, touched something quiet in your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you know someone who thinks it's too late to start again, maybe share this with them. Because sometimes all it takes is one story, one voice, to remind us what's possible.